All right, everybody, welcome into my highest rated win ever. So this was a correspondence game. We each had 24 hours per move. Basically, you play it in your downtime when you're free, and then you go on with life. My opponent in this game was rated 1935, my highest rated opponent. And spoiler alert, I win. My opponent started off with a d4 push. I responded with this flexible knight to f6. Probably going to go into some kind of queen's gambit line. We'll see. My opponent then brought the bishop out. Now, this is part of the London system. I don't know the London system very well. I know like 2 or 3 moves. And my opponent continued on in the London. I pushed my early d5. Normally, I would go e6 and then d5 like a queen's gambit. But I know that in some lines that an early d5 can make an early c5 possible. The one thing I know about the London is the London ends up with a really strong pawn structure in the center of the board, and an early c5 gets that pawn out of the way so you can develop your knight and then start chipping away at the center. That's all I know of the London. And sure enough, my opponent continued on. I pushed an early c5. If my opponent takes, I'm still going to bring my knight up, just like if this was a queen's gambit from the black pieces. Eventually, this bishop will open up, and I can capture back. But my opponent chose to keep the tension, and sure enough, there's that pawn structure. This is a London system. The knights get involved somehow. The bishop is now free to go wherever it wants. I think the bishop ends up inside the house. Don't quote me on that. I don't remember, but I think that's a phrase I heard somewhere. Either way, I develop my knight, and so now this tension is ready to go, and we can start chipping away at that center. Now we continue developing. I've got my bishop ready to go. In a queen's gambit, sometimes if the colors were reversed, black waits for white to develop their bishop, and then once they do, then they capture, forcing white to lose a tempo. That's one of the kind of counterplays that exists in the queen's gambit lines. I knew that, and so I knew that I wanted to trade this guy off before I developed my bishop, and that's exactly what I did. Now, if we look at the opening explorer, you can see there are literally hundreds of thousands of games in these lines in the London system. This doesn't say the London system because we didn't get there through the exact move order, but it's the London system. My opponent with this knight to e2 is not the most typical move. You can see we've dropped down from 84,000 games to 100 games. Most of the time this knight looks like it comes here to f3, whereas knight to e2, slightly different line. Whether it's an inaccuracy or not, I don't know, but it is still a known line. So even if I had known my London systems, this would have probably put me out of book anyway, but I've been out of book ever since I moved this knight. So once I move this knight, that's the last thing I know of the London system. I capture, and you can see that we're now in very small number of games, so I'm going to go ahead and remove this. And now I've got my bishop ready to develop. Now, my opponent's dark square bishop probably should drop back, and if I want to capture, open up this outside rook, that's a possibility. But in this case, I knew that I had it defended. My opponent decided to go ahead and trade it off. I'm kind of happy with that, to be honest with you. I have my developed pieces. I'm ready to castle. My opponent has 2 pieces developed, still needs to make one more move before he can develop his bishop, before he can get castled. So I'm comfortable at this point in time. It is not a winning position from either player. In fact, if you look at the engine says this is a very basic, dead kind of draw. Oh, you can't see the engine evaluation. Oh, yeah, you can here on the bar on the right. It's 0.0 is what the engine's saying. The idea being that neither player has an advantage. White will always maintain that slight advantage because white gets the first move. But black in this position has equalized, and I feel pretty good about that. My opponent, once they push that pawn, I know they're going to fianchetto, which means they're going to castle kingside, so I go ahead and castle kingside, and here comes the fianchetto. Now, at this point in time, I have no plan. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know any lines. I don't know any theory. All I know is when I look at the board, there's no tactics. So this is a positional game. Now, in a positional game, I want to put my pieces on better squares and give them access to do more things. Power up my pieces by repositioning them. My opponent's going to castle kingside, therefore the game is probably going to be on the king side. Therefore, I want my pieces shifted over to the king side, and I'm very proud of myself for thinking this through and spotting this and recognizing that this bishop probably needs to be staring down one of these diagonals. This knight needs to get involved into the game. So I rotate the knight around. A backwards knight move to get it into position so that I can start looking at attacks on the king side. My opponent castles, and I bring my knight in. And again, it was a flip of the coin, kind of where it should go. I like the idea of bringing it up here closer. It gives me access to, some key squares. But realistically, what it's doing is it's giving me an extra defender on my queen just in case. And if I have to move it out of the way, I've got some options. If I have to go right back, I've got some options. But realistically, I just wanted it as close to my opponent's king as possible to try to control square. So that was the only real decision I had to make, was which square I wanted that knight on. My opponent does the exact same thing. So my opponent recognizes that this is a positional game and wants to reposition their pieces. I have to develop my bishop. I know that my bishop's probably going to either stay on this diagonal, which means this pawn is troublesome. It's going to move to this diagonal. This pawn is troublesome. Or it's going to move to this diagonal. That's probably where my bishop needs to be, is on one of these diagonals to put as much pressure as possible on the king. This rook needs to get into the game, and I probably should have brought it all the way to d8. Align it with my queen, so that way my queen has extra. Always over defend. There is no harm in adding extra defenders. Whenever you place a piece, look at how it's interacting with your other pieces so that you get coordination. I was debating on c8 and d8 and the semi-open file here, but it's really not going to open up anytime soon. I'd have to attack this pawn, and I already traded away my dark square bishop, so I'm not going to be able to get to that pawn anytime soon. So probably should have come here. That way, if I push and this opens up, I have got, I'm spying all the way down the file. But I decided to go to c8, the open file. Again, that's always kind of just a good idea to help power up your rooks, is to give them as much room as possible. My opponent now repositions. My pawn is blocked by my knight, so I can't dislodge this knight. And in the time it would take me to dislodge it, my opponent's going to grab my light square bishop. I've already lost my dark bishop. I don't want to lose my light one too. So I take this time to remaneuver my bishop. It's an undefended piece, and so I'm always cognizant of that in the back of my mind. My opponent is lining up, taking the semi-open file as well. And here I make a very blah move, a really boring move, and the engine doesn't love it. If we look at the engine right now, white has a slight lead, 0.5, very slight advantage, basically the advantage of just moving first. I move the b6 pawn. The engine says that that was a waste of time, not worth it at all. And if you look at the game, right, I know that the game is coming to be the king side, so why am I messing around with the queen side pawn? Well, let me tell you why. If my opponent wanted to, they could easily attack my bishop. And if they attack my bishop, I only have two choices, backward or forward. I'm not going to go back this way because covered by knight, disconnecting my rooks. I don't really want to do that just yet. If my rook were out here somewhere, and then maybe, but who knows. So I thought, well, I could move my bishop here, right? It's defended by the pawn, and then if my opponent decides to attack it again, I can slide all the way back to the a6 square, and if I need to, I can re-rotate it down and maybe hide it all the way down here on b7 or even a8, getting that long diagonal, almost like a fianchetto bishop. But the idea is, if I did that to induce pawn moves for my opponent, now we've got some weaknesses. Now we've got some weaknesses in the position we can attack. Yes, it's on the queen side, and so that's my fallback plan. That's not my main plan, but at least there are weaknesses. At least there's something. Whereas the position where it stands now, there's really no weaknesses for either player. right? Both of us are kind of short up. I have an undefended piece. Everything else my opponent has is defended, so I didn't want to lock my bishop here because then if this attack comes, then I'm forced to come all the way back, and I just wasn't ready for that. Anyway, so I make a nothing move, which my opponent then decides to attack my central knights. And this is where the game gets really fun, because now my opponent is inducing weaknesses in order to attack me, because you have to create imbalances. In order for one player to win, you have to tip the board in your favor, and the only way to do that is to create imbalances. So my opponent started with an imbalance by attacking my knight. I move my knight with tempo on the bishop. Now, it would just be a straight trade, but I know that if my opponent were to push again, I can grab. My opponent grabs, and then I've got access to the rook. I'm pretty happy. Now, there is a funny line in here. If this were to happen, there's a funny line where my opponent doesn't have to capture back right away and can bring the queen out because they're threatening checkmate. And all of a sudden, black now has to start inducing weaknesses, allowing sacrifice possibilities. White is the one doing the attacking here, and black is the one that's in trouble. So this is what in my head, I saw this, I saw this, I saw this, and I said, you know what, I'm in good shape. I'll be up in exchange at the end of that line, and all my opponent has to show for it is one pawn. Well, in the game, my opponent attacked, I moved, and my opponent did continue to attack this central knight. Now, this gives me an opportunity to eliminate this light square bishop. Now, you know the number of games that I've played in the Queen's Gambit with the fianchetto, the Catalan, the King's Indian attack. This light square fianchettoed bishop can be really strong in attack and defense. And so me eliminating it for a knight, I felt really happy. Again, if my opponent attacks here, I knew that I had at least this, at least in my mind, or at the very minimum, I could have grabbed up here. Notice now, this knight is undefended. Well, my opponent decided to capture back, and now my knight is under attack. And notice this bishop is no longer here. There's only one attacker on that square. I have a defender on that square, so now I can park my knight here. And now at this point in time, we start doing a new round of calculations. I'm starting to think in my mind, what are the next steps? What are the next steps? Well, number one is this pawn is free. This knight is undefended. My opponent could attack my knight again. Do I have retreat squares? Yes, I do. If I bring my knight to the center of the board again, what happens when h4 is pushed? Will I have retreat squares there? No, I don't. So at that point in time, my knight does become trapped. But what if I counterattack? So my opponent's attacking my knight, I'm attacking their knight. If they take, I take, and I'm attacking their knight again. Or if I push and he were to retreat his knight somewhere, that gives me the opportunity, or if he were to retreat his knight somewhere, my knight, which came from here, now has an open square on f7. So this is what I started looking at in my mind. And sure enough, this is exactly what happened. My opponent attacked. I picked up a pawn, so I'm up a pawn now. My opponent attacked. I counterattacked. They chose to save the knight, but unfortunately, what did we say? This knight was undefended. To retreat the knight, my opponent had to retreat back here. Yes, that's in the fire, but it's defended. It's defended, so even if I were to take, my opponent could take back with the knight, and, you know, removing their undefended knight, and then I would have to remove mine to save it. But my opponent moved out of the way, which allowed me to either save my knight or to start an attack. And I decided to go for the attack. My opponent took back, which allows me to now grab a second pawn. So I'm up 2 pawns, and do you see the tactic here? There is definitely a tactic in this position. The knight's pinned. This pawn just has to move a little bit, and I can be attacking that. So my opponent has to move the king out of the way, otherwise they're going to lose a knight. And my opponent doesn't spot it. Spots the weakness. There are 2 weaknesses in my position right now, right? The undefended bishop and the now backwards e pawn because I moved the f pawn. My opponent goes for that backwards e pawn. I simply slide up. I've now trapped the knight. I'm going to win a full piece. My opponent resigns. Now, there is a way that my opponent could sort of fight back a little bit. This rook move back here pins my pawn to the queen. But I just slide back, and again, this knight is lost. So I'm still going to go up a full piece no matter what. And my opponent trusted me enough to let me know that I could win up a piece. And, you know, yeah, I've blundered games before, but with enough time on the clock, I should be able to find decent moves that with up a piece I could win. Or at least make a good endgame of it. But yeah, so my opponent, unfortunately, this last move right here didn't spot the danger levels and went for the pawn to make it, you know, where they were only down one pawn instead of two, but now they're going to lose a full piece in the process. And I win against a 1900 player, so I'm really happy about it. It was a fun game. The thing that I'm happiest about most is recognizing, number one, remembering this early c5 pawn, remembering how to get that, you know, that against the London system. But number two, recognizing that we are in a positional game and recognizing that I want my pieces in better positions, right? I kind of wish I had pushed here so that I could open up my light square bishop a little bit sooner, but oh well. You know, and as I go back and analyze this game, I'm gonna look at, you know, some scenarios where if you push this pawn, what happens? Do you get forked? Is it a problem? Is it not a problem? Who knows? But I'm proud of myself that I recognize this is a positional game, and in a positional game, I want to put my pieces where they're going to be doing the most work. I'm proud of myself for being patient with some of the moves, right? Not trying to push anything, not trying to force anything, just let the game develop. Not panicking when there are knights right in my face, you know. Recognizing that my bishop is going to need to get into the game somehow. Yes, this was a slow move, and I'm not in love with it, but I looked at, you know, I planned ahead for forcing weaknesses in my opponent's position. Instead of immediately dropping back, I had planned to go forward to force my opponent to add a weakness and now give me targets. So I had planned ahead for this kind of positional game, and that's not normally the kind of player I am, so I'm glad I was able to think these things through, and that's what you can do when you have the time, when you play a slower game like a correspondence. Yeah, and then my opponent, their real mistake, in fact, the only real mistake they made in this game was right here. By continuing to attack my knight, they induced enough weaknesses in their own position that allowed my counterattack. And then in my counterattack, this move had to be made. If we look at the engine evaluation here, yeah, black has a slight advantage here. I'm up a pawn, basically. This knight has to go back this way. And yeah, even if I take, then you can just take back and notice there's no more threat. In fact, I can't even get my queen into the... There's no threat at all. I have to move my knight to save my knight, and now I'm kind of in a more passive position. Yeah, my opponent's position is a little ugly, but this would be a little bit slower game. We would kind of have to go back to trying to find an advantage. But unfortunately, my opponent, by retreating the way they did, yeah, you can see the evaluation bar now swings from 2 point something to 5.4 when I capture here. And then, yeah, my opponent grabs. It's funny, the engine says capture with the queen. The engine wants F5. Oh, because you're still attacking the pawn and you're attacking this as well. And my guess is, yeah, there's a rook F6, yeah. You can always bring the rook up, because this is always in the back of your mind. When the king gets open, all of a sudden you start looking at bringing your rook onto those open files and really put the pressure on. Yeah, I decided to take back with the queen. That seemed to be the most sensible. That always leaves me the option to push forward. It doesn't mess up my pawn structure too badly. And yeah, here's the problem though, is it does drop a pawn, but if you look at the engine, yeah. Yeah, not much really. The engine wants me to... I'm surprised it doesn't say bring the bishop back to here to use the bishop as a defender of that pawn. Because if you push, that doesn't work. Yeah, you just drop too many things. Oh, and that comes with a check. Yeah. But either way, my opponent unfortunately missed it, and his major mistake was this right here. Just not seeing that they're dropping a whole piece. And unfortunately, that's the end of the game. That's all she wrote. So, yay, I win. Happy me. I made some positive strides. I made some mistakes still. I still overlooked some things, but I'm not perfect, obviously. But the good news is I recognized where the game was going, and I stuck with it. And we got the win. So thanks for sticking with me, guys. I appreciate you going along on this journey, and I'll catch you next time.